More than 2,000 meters up in the Caucasus Mountains, at the very end of a road that used to be impassable for half the year, sits a cluster of 4 villages where medieval stone towers still rise above family homes, built not for decoration, but because for centuries, survival here genuinely depended on having somewhere to retreat to when trouble arrived. Snow can cut this place off from the rest of the world for months at a stretch. The nearest town is a rough, multi-hour drive away, longer still before the road was ever paved at all, and roughly 200 people still choose to live here, year-round, at one of the highest points anywhere in Europe where a community has never actually left. This is Ushguli, and it might be the closest thing left to a living medieval village anywhere on the continent. Picture a settlement so high in the mountains that winter can genuinely seal it off from the outside world for months, snow burying the single road connecting it to civilization, until spring finally allows travel again. Picture a community built almost entirely around stone defensive towers, structures that have stood for well over 1,000 years, originally built not to impress visitors, but because rival families, and outside invaders alike, made owning one a matter of literal survival. And picture an ethnic group with its own distinct language spoken by only a small, shrinking population, whose isolation has preserved a way of life that has barely changed since long before most of the borders on a modern map of Europe even existed. Why would anyone choose to keep living somewhere this remote, this harsh, and this cut off from everything else? Let's find out. Ushguli sits in the upper Svaneti region of northern Georgia, tucked deep into the greater Caucasus mountain range, at an elevation of roughly 2,100 meters, making it one of the highest, continuously inhabited settlements found anywhere in Europe, a distinction it shares, depending on which regional survey you consult, with only a small handful of other equally remote mountain communities scattered across the wider Caucasus. The community isn't actually a single village at all, but 4 distinct, closely clustered settlements, Jibiani, Chvibiani, Chajashi, and Merkmeli, each within easy walking distance of the others, together forming what locals and visitors alike simply refer to as Ushguli, though each individual village retains its own identity, its own cluster of towers, and, in the case of tiny Merkmeli, a population so reduced in recent decades that parts of it feel almost like a ghost settlement, children still occasionally kicking a ball around, open yards framed by the ruins of houses that once stood full of families. The village sits directly beneath Mount Shkara, Georgia's highest peak, its glaciated, snow-covered summit rising to just over 5,000 meters and dominating the skyline in almost every direction a visitor looks. A genuinely dramatic backdrop that makes Ushguli feel less like a remote mountain hamlet and more like a settlement perched at the literal edge of the habitable world. Glaciers feeding the same rivers that carve through the valley below and eventually supply water to communities far downstream in the Georgian lowlands. The people who live here belong to the Svan, an ethnic subgroup indigenous to this specific corner of Georgia, with their own distinct language entirely separate from Standard Georgian, part of the same broader Kartvalian language family, but distinct enough that Georgian speakers from other regions typically cannot understand it at all. Unwritten for much of its history and passed down primarily through speech within families and villages tucked deep across Svaneti's isolated valleys, kept alive today partly through the same polyphonic singing traditions the region remains famous for, since songs preserve vocabulary and pronunciation that everyday conversation alone might otherwise gradually lose. The ancient Greek geographer Strabo wrote about the Svan people more than 2,000 years ago, describing them as a fierce, independent mountain population, evidence that this same community, in the same rugged landscape, has maintained a distinct identity for a genuinely extraordinary length of time. One of the longest continuously documented ethnic and linguistic identities found anywhere in the Caucasus, a region already famous among linguists for its remarkable density of distinct languages packed into a comparatively small geographic area. Svaneti also sits within the historical boundaries of ancient Caucasus, the legendary kingdom associated in Greek mythology with the tale of Jason and the Golden Fleece, a myth some historians connect to an actual local practice of using sheepskins to trap fine particles of gold from the region's mountain streams. Weighted fleeces submerged in fast-moving water to catch heavier gold particles as they wash downstream, a panning technique so distinctive that it may have inspired the legend itself, one of the rare cases where an ancient myth appears to trace back to a genuine, documentable local practice rather than pure invention. The single most recognizable feature of Ushguli, and of Svaneti more broadly, is impossible to miss the moment you arrive. Dozens of narrow, tapering stone towers rising 3 to 5 stories above the surrounding houses, some dating back as far as the 9th century. Their walls narrowing gradually toward the top and pierced with only small, deliberately narrow window openings, designed to let defenders see and shoot out while making it genuinely difficult for anyone outside to see or shoot in. These Svan towers weren't built for show. They served as watchtowers, allowing villagers to spot an approaching threat whether from a rival clan within the same village, an enemy from a neighboring valley, or invading forces sweeping through the wider Caucasus, and to warn neighboring towers by lighting signal fires the moment danger appeared. A chain of visual communication that could alert an entire valley within minutes. For centuries, Svan society operated under a code that included blood feuds between families, disputes capable of stretching across generations, and triggered by anything from a land dispute to an insult to family honor. And a family's tower functioned as a literal fortress during those conflicts. A place where an entire extended household could retreat, seal themselves inside, and wait out a siege that might last days. Food and water stores kept on hand specifically for exactly that possibility. Towers also served as refuge from a different kind of danger entirely. The frequent avalanches that sweep down from the surrounding peaks each winter, their thick stone construction offering genuine protection against a threat no ordinary wooden house could realistically withstand, a dual purpose that made the tower as essential to surviving nature here as it was to surviving conflict with other people. Chajashi, the oldest of Ushguli's 4 villages, still contains roughly 200 of these towers, either standing or in various states of ruin, one of the highest concentrations of surviving medieval defensive architecture found anywhere in Europe, a density significant enough to help earn Upper Svaneti formal recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996. Local legend holds that Ushguli once served as a summer retreat for Queen Tamar, the celebrated medieval ruler whose reign in the late 12th and early 13th centuries is still remembered across Georgia as a golden age of political power and cultural achievement, though how much of that specific local tradition reflects verified history versus centuries of accumulated folklore remains difficult to fully untangle. What's beyond dispute is that Svaneti's genuine, sustained isolation, protected by some of the most difficult mountain terrain anywhere in the Caucasus, allowed the region to develop and preserve cultural and architectural traditions that largely disappeared from more accessible parts of Europe centuries ago. Medieval defensive structures and social customs surviving here not out of nostalgia, but because the landscape itself made abandoning them genuinely dangerous for far longer than almost anywhere else on the continent. That same isolation has always defined the practical reality of daily life in Ushguli, arguably even more than its dramatic history. For much of the year, heavy snowfall renders the region's mountain roads impassable, historically cutting Ushguli off from Mestia, the nearest significant town roughly 45 kilometers away, and from the rest of Georgia entirely, for stretches lasting months at a time, some winters effectively isolating the community from October or November through as late as April or May. Residents traditionally prepared for that isolation the way mountain communities have for centuries nearly everywhere in the world, stockpiling food, firewood, and supplies well ahead of the first serious snowfall, since once winter genuinely set in, outside help or fresh deliveries simply weren't a realistic option until conditions eased again in spring. A household's entire winter survival essentially planned and secured months in advance rather than managed week to week the way it is almost everywhere else in the modern world. Even today, following improvements to the road connecting Ushguli to Mestia in recent years, winter travel remains genuinely difficult and occasionally impossible. The drive itself, even in favorable conditions, involving steep climbs, unpaved stretches, and river crossings that keep the journey feeling like a genuine expedition rather than a routine commute. 4-wheel drive vehicles considered essential rather than optional for much of the year, and travelers arriving without one often finding themselves genuinely stranded partway along the route. Culturally, Svaneti has preserved traditions found in remarkably few other corners of Europe. Svan polyphonic singing, an ancient tradition of multi-part harmonized vocal performance passed down through generations, remains an active, living practice rather than a museum piece, performed at gatherings, celebrations, and religious occasions across the region, its distinctive layered harmonies, often sung without any instrumental accompaniment at all, recognized by UNESCO as an important piece of the world's intangible cultural heritage, part of a much broader Georgian tradition of polyphonic singing considered among the oldest documented vocal traditions anywhere in the world. Religious life in Ushguli reflects a similarly layered history. Orthodox Christianity woven together with older pre-Christian beliefs and practices that never entirely disappeared even after Christianity's arrival centuries ago. A blend visible in local rituals, folk beliefs, and the small ancient churches scattered across the community, including Lamaria, a modest stone church perched on a lonely hillside at the edge of the village, gazing directly up the valley toward the glaciers of Mount Shkara, a site local tradition associates with reverence for the Virgin Mary layered on top of considerably older spiritual practices tied to the mountain itself, practices some scholars believe reach back to pre-Christian reverence for the peak as a sacred or otherwise powerful natural feature long before any church was ever built there at all. Ushguli's isolation, somewhat paradoxically, also made the region something of a center for religious revival in recent decades, with sites like Lamaria only formally reopened for regular worship within the last 10 years or so, following long stretches during the Soviet era when religious practice across the wider region was actively discouraged or suppressed entirely. Daily life for Ushguli's roughly 200 permanent residents still centers heavily around subsistence farming and livestock herding, much as it has for centuries, cattle and sheep grazing across the surrounding high alpine meadows through the brief mountain summer, families moving animals to higher pastures. As the season progresses, much the way transhuman herding communities have across mountain ranges worldwide for thousands of years, and small household gardens supplying vegetables during the short growing season, the region's harsh climate allows potatoes and hardy greens among the few crops reliable enough to withstand Ushguli's brief summers and unpredictable frosts. Traditional Svan cuisine reflects that same practical relationship with a difficult landscape. Hearty, warming dishes like kubdari, a rich, meat-filled bread seasoned with a distinctive blend of local herbs and spices, and tashmijabi, a dense, satisfying mash of cheese and potato similar in spirit to dishes found in other mountain cultures around the world, facing the same basic challenge of building calorie-dense meals from a genuinely limited range of locally available ingredients, built specifically around ingredients that store well and provide genuine sustenance through Ushguli's long, punishing winters. Despite its small year-round population, the community remains large enough to support a school, several small shops, and, remarkably for a settlement this size, 5 functioning churches. Evidence of a community determined to sustain a genuinely complete, self-sufficient way of life, rather than simply enduring as a shrinking outpost dependent entirely on outside support. In recent years, growing numbers of travelers have begun making the journey to Ushguli, specifically to experience that same remoteness and medieval atmosphere firsthand, drawn by the towers, the dramatic mountain scenery, and a genuine sense of stepping into a place that has changed remarkably little compared to the modernizing towns and cities elsewhere in Georgia. Mestia itself having transformed considerably faster in recent years as regional tourism officials work to position it as a kind of Caucasian answer to the ski resorts of the Swiss Alps. New hotels and chic cafes increasingly reshaping the town's character, even while its historic core, dotted with its own Svan towers, still hints at what the wider region once looked like everywhere. The growing tourism has brought welcome economic opportunity to a community that has historically had few options beyond farming and herding. Small guest houses and family-run restaurants increasingly supplementing traditional livelihoods. Local families opening spare rooms to travelers eager for a genuine homestay experience rather than standard hotel accommodation. Even as residents and regional officials alike continue quietly weighing how much further that growth should be allowed to reshape a place whose entire appeal rests specifically on having remained so genuinely untouched for so long, a tension familiar to remote, culturally distinctive destinations worldwide, where the very isolation that makes a place worth visiting is often the first thing put at risk the moment enough visitors start arriving to see it. None of that growing outside interest has fully solved the deeper challenges facing communities like Ushguli. Populations across Svaneti's more remote villages have gradually declined over recent decades as younger residents leave for greater opportunity in Georgia's cities or abroad. A familiar pattern echoed in isolated mountain communities across the world, intensified here by winters, genuinely severe enough to make year-round life a serious, ongoing commitment rather than a simple lifestyle choice. Tiny Merkmeli in particular reduced to little more than a handful of families among its historic ruins, a visible preview of what could eventually happen elsewhere in Ushguli without deliberate effort to keep younger generations invested in staying. Healthcare access remains limited, any serious medical need requiring travel to Mestia or beyond, a genuinely difficult prospect during the months when snow makes that journey most treacherous. And families with young children or elderly relatives requiring regular care often face genuinely difficult decisions about whether remaining in the village long-term is realistically sustainable. And the very isolation that preserved Ushguli's medieval character for so many centuries now sits in quiet tension with the modern infrastructure improvements, better roads, more reliable electricity, expanding tourism, that could make life here more sustainable for the families who remain, even as those same improvements inevitably begin to change the character of a place that has resisted exactly that kind of change for the better part of 1,000 years, a genuinely difficult balance between preserving what makes Ushguli remarkable and giving its remaining residents a realistic, comfortable future worth staying for. What makes Ushguli's story so remarkable is that its isolation was never simply an obstacle its residents had to overcome. It was, in many respects, the very thing that allowed this specific way of life. These towers, this language, these songs, this deep, layered blend of ancient and Christian belief to survive at all, protected for centuries by mountains and snow from exactly the kind of gradual homogenization that reshaped so much of the rest of Europe long ago. The people of Ushguli didn't simply endure in one of the highest, harshest inhabited corners of the continent. They built and have spent centuries carefully maintaining an entire self-sufficient civilization specifically suited to surviving there, stone tower by stone tower, generation by generation. If Ushguli's medieval towers and remarkable mountain resilience surprised you, subscribe, because there are more forgotten corners of Europe out there quietly preserving ways of life the rest of the continent left behind centuries ago.